Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals, where you can support the channel directly, get notifications for future content that I'm producing, also guest appearances I make on other people's channels, as well as engage with the channel and make recommendations for future topics. So in order to sort of, on the one hand, wait for people to trickle in, and on the other hand, to sort of set up tonight's discussion, I'm going to start with some definitions that we're going to be using. One is Jevon's paradox. Jevon's paradox states gains in efficiency result in increased consumption. This was from one William Stanley Jevons. He noticed that the increasing efficiency of steam engines did not result in the reduced use of coal, but increased coal consumption. And he feared that England might run out of coal because as it becomes more efficient, you then use more of it. An example in modern times would be car fuel efficiency and appliance electrical efficiency. This has not led to less car fuel being used and less electricity for appliances being used, but a proliferation of cars and electronic appliances. And the assumption that Jevon made was that demand would stay the same, which it doesn't. When something becomes more efficient, it becomes cheaper. And then, of course, market signals then kick in and say, well, hey, look, I have a cheaper commodity here. Let's go use it. And so we could say, let's say you have a fuel-efficient car, and it's projected to have a fuel efficiency of 5%. But the actual fuel efficiency is only 2% with a loss of 3%. Now, some of that can be explained by, for example, driving further or driving faster. And that shortfall is called the rebound effect, the difference between the theoretical efficiency gains and actual consumption. The rebound effect in this instance has a ratio of 60%. Now, with Jevon's paradox, it only applies if the rebound effect is greater than 100%. Energy gains lead to higher consumption. There's a take-back effect within 0 and 100% where actual consumption is reduced, but not as much as expected. And then there's a negative rebound effect of less than 0%, which increases efficiency, leads to more savings than expected. That's one concept. The other concept is EROI, Energy Return on Energy Investment, by Charles A.S. Hall, which is basically, Charles Hall was a biologist who argued that if we look at biological systems, in this case, predation, a predator has to consume at least as much or more energy in consuming the prey animal than he expended, otherwise he would die. And this holds for all systems. All systems have to acquire more energy than they expend, otherwise they die, which has given rise to the idea of peak oil. As these EROIs go down for peak oil, but also coal and natural gas and other energy commodities, this then leads to what is called the peak. And the peak is that at which you've consumed the most you can in a given year, and then it drops down precipitously. The other concept here is what I'll call liberal sexual ethics, which I'll define broadly speaking as the socio-sexual norms of the last century, defining contradistinction to the Christian monogamy of the Western world as existed in 1900. So that's going to include things like no-fault divorce, things like, so in the 50s and then the 60s and 70s, you had free love. And then in the early 2000s, you had the normalizing of same-sex relationships. And then in the late 2010s, early 2020s, you have the rise of the transgender movement, all of which of these I label liberal sexual ethics because they're all defined in contradistinction to what I'll call traditional sexual ethics. And traditional within the modern European American context, I define as the socio-sexual norms that existed throughout Europe and America in 1900 that were rooted in Christian morality and monogamy as the social norm for men and women in sexual relationships. I see Spinley's here. Hello, Spinley, and hello, Salmon Kingfish. All right, so what does all this mean? Well, I think there's 4 things we can do to look at this, which highlight the problems here with liberalization of sexual ethics. The first one is the increased size of the regulatory system that's needed to govern these activities. So in 1900, when we had traditional sexual ethics, the only licit form of sexual arrangement was a monogamous marriage, one that was very hard to leave because divorce, you had to have faults. And in some faith traditions, you didn't have divorce at all. So there's that. And then, a woman could either be married, single, or a prostitute. And while that was illegal in almost all states except Nevada, there's still a black market for it. So this creates a small set of predictable socio-sexual relationships which are easy to navigate, more or less, and everybody knows the rules. But as we increase that with no-fault divorce, we now have a country full of divorced people. Well, that has all sorts of legal entanglements and social entanglements, and it's very difficult to navigate. On top of that, you have people who were not divorced but engaged in extra premarital sex, so that would be the free love, 60s and 70s. And then you have people that are interested in a whole range of other sexual behavior that's not even related to a man or a woman, and also same sex. And then now you have transgenderism. What all this means is you have increasingly complex overlapping models and structures of law that create a completely unnavigable system. Now you don't know what anybody wants out of any given relationship, and you don't even know how to broach the situation. And now you have an infinite entanglement of legal hangups that people have to work through. Now, what this does is it creates massive energy costs, because this is the result of the government, the judiciary. And then they have to hire people. They have to use computers to tabulate all this stuff. They have to have paper. All of this stuff is a massive energy sink. Now, if we look at all the effort and energy spent on creating laws for the sexual behavior of Americans today versus what it cost in 1900, yeah, to my knowledge, no one's done that calculation, but it stands to reason that it's self-evidently massively more expensive and energy hungry. The second thing that we see is a lot of these sexual behaviors lead to STDs, which creates a built-in demand for an endless stream of pharmaceuticals, which creates a captive market. And a captive market is defined as a market whose exists, the participants in that market can only exist by consuming a certain commodity, in this case, antibiotics. The other thing is we have the third cost of increasing energy is the efficient cause of a lot of these sexual behaviors. A lot of these sexual behaviors are impossible without certain contrivances. Things like, condoms, feminine hygiene products, surgeries, which again have a built-in demand for that identity. And now some of these are one and done, like say a surgery, but some of these are continuous lifetime, like condom use. And so that's a built-in, again, captive market. This time you're not controlling for the effects of the activity. You are consuming the commodity in order to perform the activity. And then lastly, of four, you have a galaxy of consumer goods that are catered to each of these sexual identities. And part of the reason why there's a forced pressure for this is you can signal to other people in the sexual marketplace who you are and what you want. But that's done in such a way that you have to consume certain commodities. Now, this could be like clothes. So think of the flamboyant homosexual man. It's clothes. It's how you conduct yourself. But for 2, 3, and 4, what you see is that everybody who does this is a captive market. Now, if the left has stood for anything in the 300 odd years it's been around, it's been anti-capitalism. Everything else is just window dressing added to that. So then the question is, why has nobody noticed this? Now let's look at some of the implications here. First of all, going back to 1, the regulatory system is judicial and undemocratic. And for all the left's talk about we want more democracy, this creates an unnavigable maze. I mean, we're at the point we don't even know what consent is anymore. An unnavigable maze of legal restrictions and sexual behavior. Whereas again, in 1900, it was a lot simpler. And the people making the decisions were not, necessarily somebody far away in the Supreme Court or far away in the state capitals making these laws or in law schools. This was sort of a natural, organic convention that developed out of lived communities. Now, if we look at these things as 2, 3, and 4, so the effects of the sexual behavior, the efficient cause of the behavior, and the sort of like commodity consumption that identifies you as a part of that community, we see the importance of again, captive market. So captive market is a concept that is used by Anthony Sutton in his work on the Soviet technical transfers, 3-volume set, as well as Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is where he describes what a captive market is with regards to the Soviets. The gigantic Russian market was to be converted into a captive market and a technical colony to be exploited by a few high-powered American financiers and the corporations under their control. Now, this kind of thinking and mentality is shown in, I think it's the congressional record from 1919 about the Russian Revolution and what happened, where they interviewed a Rockefeller agent who said, "Oh yeah, that's why we're there. We were there to make sure that American and British agencies could control." Raymond Robbins was his name, to control these assets. And then he also writes later on, further down, this is chapter 11 of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. This, therefore, is an explanation that fits the evidence. The handful of bankers and promoters was not Bolshevik or communist or socialist or Democrat or even American. Above all, these men wanted markets, perfectly captive international markets, and a monopoly of the captive world market as its ultimate goal. They wanted markets that could be exploited monopolistically without fear of competition from Russians, Germans, or anyone else, including American businessmen outside the charm circle. This group was apolitical and amoral. In 1917, it had a single-minded objective, a captive market in Russia, all presented under and intellectually protected by the Sheltered League to enforce the peace. This is exactly what has been constructed within the American socio-sexual, and by the way, European and hence global market, because sexuality was seen as a market. And like with Russia in this context, they wanted a captive monopolistic control of said market. And they did that by changing people's behaviors and patterns and beliefs. Now, the other thing that's related to this is the idea of novelty and fads and things coming in and out of style. So this is from American Prosperity, Paul Mazur, who was at the time in the early 20s, president of the Lehman Brothers Bank. And this is what he says about the problem that the capitalists had at the time. Although in convention, industry belabored distribution back to in the executive offices of each business, however, councils worked at a fever heat, making plans for increased sales. Again and again, the problem was given to the sales department, and time after time, the forger set out on his own routes with a magnifying glass to glean every dispensable wisp of demand. This time, however, his resources brought unforeseen consequences. Any community that lives on staples has relatively few wants. The community that can be trained to desire change, to want new things, even before the old has been entirely consumed, yields a market to be measured more by desires than by needs, and a man's desires can be developed so that they will greatly overshadow his needs. Newness or style become the new order of the day. Retailers look for novelties with which to tickle the jaded appetites of lady consumers. Sales organizations begin to urge upon production changes instead of standardized low-cost units. Saturation came quickly in the market, brought to satisfy demand. But saturation would never be reached if what was in style could be changed quickly enough and made soon obsolete. Standardization became increasingly subordinate to style. Uniformity of production was subordinate to style appeal. The factors necessary for sales began to impose themselves in this manner upon manufacturing. That is exactly what has happened to human sexuality, which is why we see these fads becoming separated by shorter and shorter periods of time. Because basically what we're dealing with is overproduction with regards to human sexuality. Amongst the traditional norms that existed in 1900, these were low-cost relationships that met needs, not desires. And so they were sustainable. And they were fixed. And you couldn't make a lot of money on them. So the contention here is that there's a fundamental contradiction between the modern left. And this goes all the way back to the pre-woke left, to the 1890s. You can't have, on the one hand, an attempt to deconstruct capitalism, or more radically, industrial civilization on one hand, and then advocate socio-sexual norms and mores that can only exist within a capitalist framework or a industrial framework. And so, for example, one of the reasons why you didn't see these kinds of sexual behavior in the Soviet Union or other communist countries was because they had no desire to create captive markets of dependent sexual consumers. They objected to the principle of commodification in the first place. And if you have a pre-industrial society, with the exceptions of concentrations of wealth in the courts of a king or a merchant family, where you could have increased energy consumption up to a limit, you don't really have the possibility of doing this. So if we look at that, we can also then look at another theme. And there's the theme that, well, traditional social sexual ethics were just mean and bad or oppressive or whatever. And again, what they really mean is Christianity. So what are some of the conclusions that follow from this? Well, one, let's look at Frank Herbert's Dune. One of the things that Frank Herbert talks about with his ideas of the Fremen is that the environment creates conditions and costs on people that they then have to take into account in creating their ethical systems. And then religion is a means by which, I guess in a pre-scientific age, he assumes they would have justified those conditions. And so, and he says, as far as that goes, that's legitimate survival. It's legitimate for that people of that tribe because that's how they survive. Well, if we look at the idea that traditional social relationships between men and women, sociosexual relationships between men and women, or what we saw in 1900, well, why are these costs? What are the costs that are being imposed? Well, one, low energy. So you're not going to have condoms. You're not going to have feminine hygiene products. You're not going to have advanced surgeries. You're not going to have large-scale consumer goods, like the swag that you have to wear to be identified with this or that subculture of sexual identities. And so without the energy to fuel any of this, then you just aren't going to have it. You in fact can't have it because the material, again, the left, if the left stands for anything, it's not only anti-capitalist, it believes that environment is everything. Material conditions condition everything. That's what I've heard my entire life. Well, what do you know? Apparently not. Apparently not. Apparently, this was not the result of material conditions, but an evil conspiracy. I mean, it sort of becomes just a self-parody at this point. So when you really understand that the liberalization of sexuality rather than liberation is actually a form of social control. And it's a form of social control in that it reduces sex itself to a commodity, and it also reduces the individual consumer within that sexual subculture as a commodity. And again, growing up, listening to the anti-globalist left and almost, from the Marxists to like the liberals, commodification was one of the worst things you could do to somebody. In fact, this is the joke, right? They claimed that the wife was commodified. That's what made marriage bad. It's a self-parody. No, the commodification takes place when you apply market forces, completely all throughout the human sexual experience. Whereas what marriage does is it takes them out. Because if you look at a sexual marketplace that existed in 1900 and you had eligible women and they get married, the market gets smaller. It doesn't get bigger. And they're taken out of the market. They're not kept in it. Whereas now everybody's in the market all the time, 24/7. And so what this does is you've created, and that's why we have the term the sexual marketplace, because it's all been commodified. So the joke is that the attack on marriage and family and the Christian sexual norms was framed by the left as commodifying the woman, when in fact, in commodifying sex, when in fact, what's going on now, what they've been advocating for the last 80 years is what's commodifying everything, and therefore making them dependents and slaves. Because so what are the conclusions we can draw from this? There's quite a few. The first conclusion you can draw is that that sexual identities they have no revolutionary potential. Or rather, let me rephrase it, no revolutionary potential in an anti-capitalist sense, because they themselves exist only as agents of capital, because they're captive markets. They can't exist without capital. So if you're gonna lead a revolution against capitalism or revolution against industrial civilization, and depending on which leftists you talk to, it could be one or the other or both, they're never going to be allies in this struggle, because the material conditions that they need to exist will not exist in these new systems. And so then you have to ask the question, well, why were these ideas packaged, right? Because the old left didn't care about sexual identity. I mean, there was a free love angle for a while. So they were like, the OG leftists like in the 1890s and such. So there was still a kernel of that there. But part of the packaging, I think, was in part capital's desire to protect itself. Because you're not going to have a workers' revolution against capital if all the workers are essentially sexual commodities. Because then they won't be able, their identity is tied with them being a commodity, so they won't exist without the capital structures. And it creates this sort of like short-circuiting effect within the reasoning process where you have, well, we have this stated preference over here and this stated preference over here, and these two preferences are completely contradictory to each other. So that's one thing. The other thing I think we can say what follows is that with one of the claims amongst certain elements of the right, for example, neo-reaction, claim that the modern capital structures can be best managed by a sort of like right-wing social elite where they impose certain selective right-wing social norms. That's not going to work, right? Because if you were to enforce, now I would support this idea if we were to enforce or encourage or make provision for traditional sexual norms between men and women today, you would remove all these commodities. All of these human commodities would go away because you've uncommodified sex. Now, that's a means of social control. And that's one of the ways in which the capital structures maintain control. So by breaking that, you're breaking one of the most effective means of control over the people. So a sort of like NRX elite would not in fact be the people that would be best fitted to run and manage the system. The other thing is, if we see all of this tied to energy consumption, we can look at peak everything as it's described by Richard Heinberg, or the long emergency as it's described by James Howard Kunstler, both of which are looking at energy commodity peaks as a result of poor EROI ratios. We're looking at peak sex. And what I mean by peak sex is twofold. One is the frequency between individuals and what we might call cornucopia of possibilities, both of which are contingent upon extremely high levels of energy consumption and production, which as we go to the other side and energy consumption and production goes way down, these new material conditions will then eliminate this. And so this also explains why we see incels and the sexless zoomers, because we've reached peak sex. I mean, from 1960 to 2020, I think more people have had more sex than any other time in human history, full stop. And that's all related to energy consumption. The other thing that we can expect to see that will further drive this retreat of sexual liberal ethics is the idea of a catabolic collapse by Joseph Tainter. He talks about the idea that we have a complex system of systems. And by a complex system of systems, think, for example, of a ship with compartmentalized hulls. If one compartment fills with water, the ship won't sink. But if, like, say, 80% of the compartments do, then it will. And so, right, it's going to take a systemic, systems-wide collapse for the system of systems, the empire, to collapse. And what that means is there's going to be cannibalism. And they're going to cannibalize capital stock. They're going to cannibalize industry. And the way I see this is there's going to be a tiered retreat. First is we're going to see a shortage of consumer goods and commodities, because those are considered not essential to the maintaining of the imperial structure. Second of all, we'll see, as this collapse progresses, large-scale industries running out of resources. And then lastly, we'll see government agencies running out of resources. And so I think one of the best ways to look at this is if we look at the Dobbs case, you can argue on the one level that it's the result of the dark horse that was Donald Trump, who stacked the court with a bunch of conservatives, which I guess is true as far as it goes. But I think ultimately, why was this allowed to happen in the first place? That's the real question. And I think ultimately there are people in the government trying to get ahead of the energy crisis and the capital collapse. And so what they're doing is, rather than by getting ahead of it, they're then dismantling all of this stuff and the legal rigmarole behind it, so that you don't have to be stuck with the bag. Because you can make any laws you want and say that you have any rights you want, but if the energy levels that you're living in isn't enough to meet that need, it doesn't matter what you legislate or what you put on paper. It just means it's not going to happen at all. So there's that. And the other point I wanted to make with regards to captive markets and Sutton and all of these sexual identities as themselves captive markets and slaves to capital structures is also Rockefeller and Kinsey. So, Kinsey's two works, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, I think it was 1953. was funded by the Rockefellers. Now the left always has this habit of follow the money, but apparently follow the money stops when it comes to Kinsey. Now, the issue here then is, why would the Rockefellers want to fund Kinsey? Well, because they wanted to commodify sex. They wanted to create captive markets so they could monopolistically control of sexual identity groups. And so they had to fund Kinsey and other researchers to shift the Overton window to make it acceptable to talk about these things, and to then repeal laws which existed since the days of Comstock and before that would have greatly restricted this kind of activity. So, for example, anything that related to sexually explicit material or family planning was outlawed in distribution by Comstock in 1973. Now, this wasn't a federal law. It was a District of Columbia, but almost all the states in the Union followed suit. And so so the left has this criticism of the Comstock Laws that they were repressive and yada yada. You know, we've all been here before. But what it actually meant was that it protected sexuality from being commodified. And the Rockefellers funded various researchers, as did other private nonprofit, and nonprofit organizations, funded various researchers to dismantle the legal apparatus that protected Christian monogamy, and then replaced it with this commodified captive market that they now monopolistically control. And so the people in these positions will defend the system to the death, no matter what the cost. So I think it's another thing we can deduce from this. The other thing is, Joseph Tainter has this idea of organization and energy. If you have energy scarcity or low energy states, you have certain forms of planning that tend to be more robust. So they, or I guess, to use Nicholas Taleb's claim, anti-fragile, and not very complicated. They're kind of simple, full of redundancies, because that's how you survive in a low energy state. When you get to a high energy state, you have increasingly complex systems, and the rationalization for these complex systems is that these systems are efficient. And they are, until they're not, right? When you reach peak energy and then you start a decline or a crash, then these complex systems become very vulnerable and break down. Now, the changes in human and the changes in sexual behavior that the left championed from 1920 to 2020 and beyond are correlated with these increased efficiencies in production and energy. And so when that goes down, we'll see this go down too. And what I'm saying is that the Dobbs decision is kind of a bellwether canary in the coal mine. It's really showing us that the people in power kind of know this is coming, and they're beginning to act on it. That's what I think we can say that this is an indication of. And what this also means then is that, more broadly speaking, monogamy is a socio-sexual relationship, not just Christian monogamy. The reason why we see that, along with heteronormativity, as normative throughout most of human history is, again, not a conspiracy. It's the result of the environmental conditions. It's just that arrangement which is the most robust and resilient under a low energy state. And so if we look at J.D. Unwin's Sex and Culture, I believe 1936, he said that, this was relatively normative. Now, we saw deviations from that at the end of a civilizational life cycle, when that civilizational life cycle had, become an empire and had developed a lot of resources and energy to be able to indulge in some of these practices, which he then says, within rapid succession leads to the diminution of the society. This is also something that the lesbian philosopher historian Camille Paglia points out. She was interviewed by Reason magazine, I think like 10 years ago. And she basically told Nick Gillespie that we're the problem. We, the sexually liberated, are the problem, which I thought was quite an admission for her to say. But again, you look at the course of empires, and again, the reason why you see peak sexual liberation at the top of this arc is that there's an energy threshold that keeps it up. But the other problem is, and we can deduce from this, is that this is consuming energy without yielding any actual material benefit. This is a control mechanism. And so eventually there's a contradiction that develops with capital accumulation. You're going to have to roll out this control grid to make sure the workers and the population are more or less stable and don't threaten the capital stock directly and don't go, full King Lud and smash the machines, or, full Butlerian jihad and smash the machines, but it yields no material value. And so then you have to acquire more resources to upkeep all of this, as well as the maintenance of the capital stock itself, which doesn't produce any tangible material value. And then eventually you have a tipping point where the costs of maintaining the system exceed the cost of resource acquisition, leading to the collapse. And so one cost among many, because it's not the only cost, is this increasingly, what we would say, unproductive sociosexual relationships that we're seeing develop across the Western world today. And not surprisingly, it's corresponding to this level of collapse. So, to make a very long story short, what I'll say is that modern sexual liberalization and modern sexual ethics are not liberation. They are the commodification of all aspects of sex. Furthermore, they are the creation of captive markets that are meant to be monopolistically exploited by corporations that have massive energy demands. And as we reach peak everything, including peak sex, then we're going to see all of this go away. And I don't know how fast, right? It's a downward slope, and it might be steady, it might be precipitous. I don't know. So, but looking at that, we're going to see that as a result. And then second of all, now again, I can't go into all the details here because it's not really part of the discussion. But more specifically, if we're going to take, say, the more difficult position to defend, especially in the modern world, is the Mosaic Law, from which Christian sexual ethics is in some sense derivative from, right? Christ and Christianity, if anything, they don't renounce the previous mores. They make the regulations tighter. So, right, Christ will say that, well, Moses said you could divorce people, but I say don't divorce. So he's making it a tighter. So it's building upon and tying up some loopholes. But let's look at Moses, though, right? What I would argue, and if you want to check this out, check out the Paleo Manifesto, that especially with the case laws revolving around human sexuality, the animals you can eat, and resource use, like, say, the Jubilee and sabbatical years. It's basically a framework for existing in a harsh environment, the desert, and sustainably in a low energy context. So, like the relatively extreme rules of the Fremen in their social mores on Arrakis, we see that but they are justified by the constraints of the environment placed on them, as Frank Herbert says. We also see that, and then even the more I guess you could say milder, but in other ways Christianity is not milder, it places higher constraints on the individual. That those sexual ethics are the result of the ratiocination of thought on and the reification of the demands placed on the culture by the environment. And so that's sustainable. None of these other sexual behaviors are sustainable. Now, and again, I've couched it all in these terms in order to reach the other side of the aisle. If you talk about terms of, morality by assuming an implicit Christian morality, that's not going to work because they don't believe in that. Or if they do, it's only in a general vague sense and it's not really determinative for them. Whereas if you appeal to concepts that they putedly care about and then point out that you've got these contradictions here that are irreconcilable, that are actually hurting your cause, hopefully you can get them to actually see that distinction. Because again, you can't square, say, monopolistic control of captive markets of sexual identities, which is what we have now, with either anti-capitalism or deindustrialization, either of which would lead to the end of these identities. So the class position, if you want to use a real left-wing term, of all of these groups is defenders of capital. So in the 19th century, we talk about, well, the Marxist socialist pyramid was like, well, you had, at the top capital, and then you had like the military and the government protecting it with force of arms. And then you had the church and the clergy giving the intellectual moral justification for it. Right. But today it's different, right? Instead of the church, it's, the university consensus. And we still have the military, that's for sure. But also as a sort of like managerial class, you have a lot of these people that identify with these various sexual identities that exist on a spectrum within the the liberalization of sexual ethics. But that means that by their own consumption habits and their own identity, they are the class allies of capitalism. I think, for example, transgender individuals represent the court eunuchs in the same way that a eunuch would support the empire because he had no future, literally, because he was castrated. Many of these people as well will be just as loyal to the elite and the power establishment as any eunuch was to the emperor of China or the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. And we'll see that a lot of these other groups as well are going to be extremely loyal to the system. So any sort of anti-authoritarian system, whether it's libertarianism, whether it's anarchism, whether it's socialism, that seeks to build a resistance movement to either the empire or capitalism or industrialization or whatever, is going to have to realize that these people in their current iteration are not allies. They cannot be integrated into any thoroughgoing movement. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't be convinced to change their lifestyle and live some other way. I mean, that's sort of the implicit argument behind Christianity. It's like, well, you might be our enemy at the moment, but if we can convert you to the faith, then of course you're no longer our enemy. And this idea, if I make my enemy my friend, have I not conquered my enemy? I brought that up in my third stream dealing with the dove strategy. So in that sense, we need to look at that. And again, it really boggles the mind that this kind of analysis has never been done by a left-wing academic on human sexual behavior. Now, I think there's a couple explanations for that. One explanation is that as education has been controlled by, private corporate interests under the guise of, non-government agencies or non-government organizations, they've intentionally created this ersatz identity in order to, confuse their opposition and sort of defang any sort of workers' revolution. Because, again, let's go back to Russia, right? Lenin shot the prostitutes. The Soviet Union arrested homosexuals. They did not tolerate this kind of behavior in the new socialist system. So clearly they saw it as a threat. The technical term is called bourgeois decadence, which even in Weimar Germany, before the rise of Hitler, the socialists opposed as well. And in fact, one of the aspects of Orwell's 1984 was that the party would exert a pernicious control over human sexual affairs because they viewed that as a threat to the party structure itself. So clearly they weren't going to have all of these diverse expressions of human sexuality and the identity groups to go with it. The other one is, another explanation possibly, is that many on the left are just power-hungry megalomaniacs, and they'll take whatever position they can as long as it maintains their position within society as a dominant, respected position. That's another one. Another one is that they are, in some sense, lacking in self-control, right? And they just have poor impulse control, and those are just the kinds of things that they want to do as long as they're allowed to do them, whatever the cost might be. So the cost to the environment, the cost to strengthening capital, and everything else. And so I think it's going to be a complex explanation. But what I would argue is, one, probably the most important aspect of this is just the framing device of all of these left-wing agitators and pundits going through non-government organizations to be educated, and then they're fed this mashup of philosophy and ideology that doesn't actually fit. And then second of all, people who are just amoral, power-hungry megalomaniacs, and then C, people that have deviant tendencies. And so I think a combination of all of those are what is going to explain this, among other things. And so as a sort of modest proposal at the end of this, I think that the only consistent position, because again, this increased level of capitalization also renders it nearly impossible to have a traditional lifestyle that many on the right would want to have, because it stands in the way of the commodification of sex. The moderate proposal is the third position, where we have on social issues a broad right-wing tendency, and on economic issues a more left-wing tendency. Not necessarily Marxist, but things like, stronger unions, possible different modes of production, like say syndicalism or mutualism or whatever, or something even older, because now they're working in tandem. And there was a riddle that was proposed on Brenton Lengel's channel with Caleb Maupin, and they were talking about, why was the Soviet Union so socially conservative by the later years, like from 1960 onward? Well, frankly, from Khrushchev onward, or actually, frankly, Stalin onward. Well, because it had to be, because of the material conditions. And by conservative, they primarily meant socially in the terms of the sexual conduct of Soviet citizens. And so that, I think, is the other thing we can deduce from that. So yeah, there's a lot here, a lot here. I'm tying together a lot of different threads, a lot of different insights, and we'll see what the reaction is. So we're gonna check out the. Let's see here. No super chats tonight. All right. Let's see. Cyber Ninja Zero. I honestly think no-fault divorce wouldn't have been a problem if it wasn't for alimony. Alimony granted women access to a slave class. Yeah, that's sort of what's inevitably happened. But the other element too, though, is this is more, but you can't look at no-fault divorce in isolation, right? It's a part of a broader movement or force that this is like the beginning of. We have here Isle of Arran. Have you read about abiogenic petroleum? If so, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, because it apparently contradicts the peak oil theory. Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't really looked into it at all. Now let me just sort of frame this real quick. I didn't used to be a huge. I used to be what James Howard Kunstler calls a technical cornucopian. I used to think that technology would create new solutions to the problems that it created. It could just keep on doing so more or less indefinitely. And one of the things that started to get me to shift in this thinking was, I think it was in the documentary Cascadia, where Derek Jensen said that technology creates new technology to solve the problems that technology creates. And I also heard that repeated by James Howard Kunstler, which seems to come from Joseph Tainer's work on catabolic collapse. In which case, I would say that shifted my opinion to a more scarcity mindset. Now, even if we argue that oil is abiotic, the problem is, even if it's naturally filling, we're still consuming it faster than it would be refilling. So, for example, look at a water aquifer. Water aquifers naturally refill due to rainwater and runoff. But that being said, we're still consuming aquifers faster than they can be produced. So again, I haven't looked into the theory completely, but if it's anything, if you argue that it can be refilled, like say a water aquifer can be refilled, at what rate? And what are the rate we're consuming at? We're consuming it at an exponential rate. So even if that were true, I think we would still eventually outstrip the carrying capacity of this resource. Okay, let's see. Jacob J. Hello. Yeah. Let's see what else we got here. Isle of Arran. It all makes sense when you read about Gregory Bateson's double blind and consider how it has been weaponized and turned to a political agenda. I've not read Isle of Arran. I've not read Double Blind, so I don't know what you're talking about. J. Burnin. Hello, Todd. Hello, JD. Or hello, Jay. I think you have a video later tonight. Minoan. Hello, President Folly. I will listen to the whole thing. Well, you might have to listen twice, Minoan, as you said you do before. Let's see. M. Supply chains are a good example of that. M. Efficient until they aren't. Yes, exactly. M, is that yeah, that's from Fritz Lang's M. That was a good film. Let's see. Rick Verger, congrats for Todd on the 81.5% engagement on this video. 13 likes out of 16 viewers. Yeah. I have a loyal, dedicated fan base. I like that. Let's see. M, yes, he has a very unique perspective. I think you're referring to me. Thank you. Let's see here. M, when I read the Gospels, one thing that struck me was how hard Jesus went on divorcees. Yeah, because you have to. I mean, look at modern day America where we're full of people who are divorced. They can't build long-term relationships with the opposite sex or with anyone else. These people have been fundamentally harmed in ways that are very difficult to quantify. And and what it does is it has this ratchet knock-on effect where people can't build long-term relationships with each other unless you pay them. You work for the government, you work for a corporation. But the government and a corporation will fire you at the drop of a hat. So really nobody can keep a long-term relationship going at all. Let's see. Spindley at Rick Verger. In a smaller, less diverse groups, people are more likely to tackle actions that benefit the group without need of personal reward. Yes. Yes, that is true. M. Being trans is the new Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, until it's not. Until something else takes its place. I mean, Ukraine is also the new Pledge of Allegiance. Do you have the Ukraine flag? Cyber Ninja Zero. There's an odd number of Troon dissenters. AA seems to be a magnet for them. Don't know what that's talking about. Let's see. M. How would the potential wider adoption of nuclear affect your theory? Right. Well, obviously, nuclear energy creates a lot more energy. It's very EROI efficient. The problem with nuclear, well, one is it maybe it's too late to even implement at this point. Say from like 1970 to 2020 would have been time to implement nuclear. What? First of all, you have to phase out cars because there's no way you're going to power cars electrically. There's not enough rare earth materials for like platinum and all these other things, lithium that you need for them. You're going to have rails, which could be done. I mean, we could go from cars to rails, but it would be a huge social effort, one which I don't think the Western nations are capable of performing. And furthermore, getting the resources out of the ground with like earth movers and bulldozers and all that stuff and complicated machinery is still going to take fossil fuels to get around because you have to have trucks. You have to have giant earth movers. And I don't see how you're going to power that solely through electricity. So it's still sitting on this unstable foundation of oil and natural gas and other cheap energy resources. And so, well, what it would do, is it would kick the predictions down the road. I don't think it would stop them fundamentally. Let's see. Even though that admittedly looks like unlikely considering the fetishes of the ruling class. Yeah, exactly. Cyber Ninja Zero. Nuclear takes a long time to develop and isn't as efficient as profitable as oil. Yeah, exactly. And so I think one other thing that is sort of related to all this that I'll bring up is this is a whole other topic, which I'm not going to start, but just again, maybe as a modest proposal, bring up the idea that we have, why would a parochial society prefer simpler relationships, right? So homogeneity as opposed to diversity, homogeneity of socio-sexual relationships, homogeneity of philosophical / religious beliefs, homogeneity of cultural norms, homogeneity of ethnicity. Well, on just completely, systems levels, these are, if you have all of these points controlled for with homogeneity, you have essentially robust systems, even anti-fragile systems that have built-in redundancy that can navigate low energy environments. Whereas high energy environments, you can afford to specialize and have all of this and, specialized investments and everything, and it's different. So tying this back to the discussion about human sexuality, the reason why you would want to have traditional sociosexual norms that we had in 1900 in the United States and in Europe is because it's where you stand, right? It's not this web of impossible to navigate relationships and expectations and where you stand in the situation. Which, yeah, I also forgot to mention that per one, you get this Kafka-esque nightmare trying to figure out what consent is. So that's another means of control. Nobody knows how to act because nobody is acting within a predictable system. This also has echoes of 1984, where the party changes its position every other month to keep the people off guard. So what was consent one day is not consent the other. What was in one day is out the other. So all of that is a problem. And so the traditional monogamous relationships that dominated the West for centuries were just the most efficient. Now, you could argue, too, looking at the Jack Goody thesis, that this was a development of Western medieval Christianity, and that prior to that, there was a kind of like what we might call Eurasian ethic, where you had which tolerated polygamy and close kinship marriages. But I would argue that mode was displaced because it was less efficient and was less capable of dealing with the situations at hand. Because if a few men monopolize all the women, then you have a lower birth rate because there's a lot of men that don't get to reproduce at all. And given how short life expectancies were in antiquity and the Middle Ages, over time, that will have a ratchet effect of population decline. Whereas distributing women out on a first come first serve basis with one per customer, no sharing. Hate to use a commodification language here, but after just going on this whole spiel against it, but at least I think makes the point that it allows for more population growth. And as plagues and wars and famines devastate the population, and you have a constant generative process of having more and more people, then you can weather those storms, and societies that couldn't just went extinct. And so the last thing I wanted to say, and I forgot to bring this up in the main part of the show, is that the claim that having fewer children is green and these new alternative sexual lifestyles, is more green and i.e. less energy consumptive than having children the normal, to quote the song Cats in the Cradle, the usual way, is pure nonsense. Like, tally up the cost of 7 children or even 1 child with lifetime condom use made of plastic, which is oil, which is dug out of the ground, and all the huge environmental cost of all of these things is just exponential. There's no environmental cost, a minuscule environmental. What was the environmental cost of a family of 9 back on the frontier in 1850? A lot lower than a guy that is using all of these oil-based technologies to indulge in a wild and varied sexual life existence. A lot more. So this is like the opposite of green. It's like the anti-green. So again, that was an important point I forgot to make. Cyber Ninja Zero, the video is nuclear. Let me back it up. Cyber Ninja Zero, nuclear takes a long time to develop and isn't as efficient and profitable as oil. Yeah, and it's also more dangerous with meltdowns. American populist, Europe is now importing coal as a stopgap before winter. Yes, I heard WION report on that. Cyber Ninja Zero. The video is nuclear power green, goes into why it hasn't been mass adopted, despite Reddit shilling. American populist, France is begging Algeria for more gas now. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.